The spotlight has always been a double-edged sword. For decades, rock and roll promised freedom, rebellion, and the chance to live without rules. But behind the leather jackets, the screaming guitars, and the sold-out arenas, some of the biggest names in music were hiding truths that could have destroyed their careers overnight. They performed for millions while concealing parts of themselves that the world wasn't ready to accept. Some took their secrets to the grave. Others waited until the very end to speak. These are the stories of 20 rock legends who lived double lives, navigating fame while hiding in plain sight. If you're ready to go beyond the sanitized versions of rock history, subscribe now. You won't find these stories in the official biographies. Freddie Mercury, the king who ruled alone. Freddie Mercury didn't just command a stage, he owned it. As the frontman of Queen, his voice could shake stadiums, and his presence could hold millions spellbound. But while the world celebrated his talent, a question always lingered beneath the surface. Who was Freddie Mercury when the lights went down? He never labeled himself publicly, but those close to him knew the truth. His relationships with men were whispered about in industry circles, yet Mercury kept his private life fiercely guarded. In an era when being different could end a career, he walked a tightrope between authenticity and survival. His flamboyant persona gave him freedom to express himself artistically, but it also became a shield, a way to be himself while maintaining plausible deniability. The pressures mounted as his fame grew. Rumors swirled constantly, and the tabloids hunted for confirmation. Despite selling out arenas worldwide, Mercury remained isolated in ways few understood. Then, in 1991, tragedy struck. His death from AIDS-related complications forced the world to confront what many had suspected but refused to acknowledge. The industry that profited from his genius had offered little protection during his struggle. He had given everything to his art, yet fought his final battles largely alone. His legacy endures not just through his music, but through the questions his life forces us to ask about fame, acceptance, and the price of living authentically. David Bowie, the shapeshifter. David Bowie made a career out of transformation. Ziggy Stardust, the Thin White Duke, Aladdin Sane, each persona was a carefully crafted mask that allowed him to explore different aspects of identity and performance. But beneath the theatrical costumes and avant-garde presentations was something more personal. Bowie openly identified as bisexual in the early 1970s, a revelation that sent shockwaves through the music industry. His androgynous appearance and fluid approach to gender challenged everything the rock world thought it knew about masculinity. In concerts, he would blur the lines between male and female presentation, creating performances that felt otherworldly. His boldness inspired countless artists, particularly in heavier rock and metal scenes that would later adopt his theatrical approach to performance. But his openness came at a cost. Critics dismissed his sexuality as a publicity stunt, claiming he was simply trying to shock audiences for attention. Conservative groups protested his shows, and some radio stations refused to play his music. Yet Bowie never retreated. He continued pushing boundaries, forcing the industry to reckon with questions about identity that many preferred to avoid. His influence extended far beyond his own music. Without Bowie's fearless approach to self-expression, the rock and metal scenes might never have evolved to embrace theatrical performance and personal authenticity. He proved that breaking social norms could coexist with commercial success, though the path he carved was anything but easy. Janis Joplin, the outsider's voice. Janis Joplin's voice was unlike anything the music world had heard before. Raw, powerful, and dripping with emotion, she sang as if her life depended on it. In many ways, it did. Her performances weren't just concerts, they were exorcisms, purging pain and loneliness that had followed her since childhood. But beneath the electrifying stage presence was a woman struggling to find acceptance in a world that constantly judged her. Joplin never made public statements about her sexuality, but those in her inner circle knew she had relationships with both men and women. In the late 1960s, such openness was dangerous, especially for a woman in rock music. She lived her life on her own terms, refusing to conform to expectations about how a female musician should behave or who she should love. Her search for belonging played out in her music. Songs like "Piece of My Heart" weren't just performances. They were confessions. The vulnerability in her voice connected with audiences who felt equally out of place in a conformist society. But that same vulnerability made her a target. Critics focused on her appearance, her drinking, her wild lifestyle, anything but her extraordinary talent. The loneliness never left her. Despite her fame, Joplin struggled with feeling like an outsider wherever she went. Her tragic death at 27 cut short a life that had already given so much to music, leaving behind questions about what she might have accomplished in a more accepting world. Rob Halford, the metal god's revelation. Rob Halford defined what a metal frontman should be. As the singer of Judas Priest, he introduced the leather and studs aesthetic that became synonymous with heavy metal. His powerful vocals and commanding stage presence made him a legend. But for decades, he carried a secret that he feared would destroy everything he had built. In 1998, during an MTV interview, Halford casually mentioned he was gay. The revelation was unexpected, and for a moment, it seemed uncertain how the notoriously masculine metal community would respond. Heavy metal had built its identity around aggression and traditional masculinity. Would fans accept that one of the genre's most iconic figures didn't fit that mold? The response surprised many. Rather than turning away, most fans embraced him. They recognized that his sexuality had nothing to do with his talent or his contributions to metal. If anything, the revelation added new layers to understanding his artistry. The leather aesthetic he had popularized suddenly took on new meaning, a coded expression of identity hiding in plain sight. But Halford's coming out did more than affect his own career. It forced the metal community to confront its assumptions about masculinity and belonging. If the metal god himself was gay, what did that mean for the genre's rigid definitions of toughness? His honesty opened doors for other LGBTQ+ musicians in metal, proving that authenticity and heaviness could coexist. Elton John, the showman's struggle. Elton John's flamboyance made him one of the most recognizable figures in music history. His outrageous costumes, oversized glasses, and theatrical performances were legendary. But for years, that same flamboyance served a dual purpose. It was both self-expression and camouflage, a way to be himself while maintaining distance from questions he wasn't ready to answer publicly. Behind the spectacle was a man wrestling with his identity. John married a woman in 1984, a decision driven partly by genuine affection and partly by the crushing pressure to conform. The marriage lasted 4 years before ending in divorce. It wasn't until 1988 that he publicly came out as gay, acknowledging what many had long suspected, but what the industry had carefully avoided discussing directly. The years of hiding took their toll. John struggled with addiction and depression, self-medicating to cope with the disconnect between his public image and private reality. His music, always deeply emotional, took on new meaning once fans understood the personal struggles behind songs about loneliness and longing for acceptance. His eventual openness helped change perceptions not just about him, but about LGBTQ+ people in the music industry more broadly. His continued success after coming out demonstrated that authenticity didn't have to mean career suicide. But the damage from those hidden years lingered, a reminder of the psychological cost of living a double life under constant public scrutiny. Lou Reed, The Velvet Underground. Truth. Lou Reed never fit comfortable categories. As the leader of the Velvet Underground, he created music that explored the darker corners of human experience: drug addiction, sexual taboos, urban decay. His lyrics didn't shy away from controversial topics, including explicit references to sexuality that shocked audiences in the 1960s. Reed was open about his bisexuality, though he approached the topic with characteristic defiance rather than seeking approval. He sang about relationships with men in songs like Walk on the Wild Side, which became a surprise hit despite its frank discussion of transgender individuals and alternative lifestyles. His willingness to explore these themes in his music made him a pioneer, though it also made him a target. The rock establishment didn't know what to do with Reed. He was too provocative, too honest, too willing to discuss topics that polite society preferred to ignore. Radio stations edited his songs. Critics dismissed his work as obscene. But Reed never apologized or retreated. He continued making music that reflected the full complexity of human sexuality and identity. His influence extended far beyond his own records. Punk, alternative, and even metal musicians cited Reed as an inspiration, drawn to his refusal to sanitize his art for mainstream acceptance. He proved that rock music could be a vehicle for exploring uncomfortable truths, paving the way for generations of artists who refused to hide who they were for commercial success. Joan Jett. The Runaways' Secret. Joan Jett became a rock icon by refusing to play by anyone's rules. As a founding member of the Runaways and later as a solo artist, she proved that women could rock just as hard as men. Her image, leather jacket, dark eyeliner, Gibson Melody Maker guitar, became instantly recognizable. But while her professional life was an open book, her personal life remained carefully guarded. Jett has never publicly labeled her sexuality, consistently refusing to discuss her romantic life in interviews. When pressed, she deflects, insisting that her private life is nobody's business. This reticence has led to decades of speculation, with rumors and whispers following her throughout her career. Some have read her refusal to discuss relationships as confirmation of something she doesn't want to acknowledge publicly. Her silence on the topic is itself significant. In an industry that constantly demands personal revelations from its stars, Jett's insistence on privacy is an act of resistance. She has made it clear that she will be defined by her music, not by who she loves. That stance has earned her respect from some and frustration from others who wish she would be more open. Whether her privacy stems from a desire to protect her personal life or from deeper concerns about how revelations might affect her career remains unclear. What is certain is that Jett has spent decades navigating an industry that wants to know everything about its stars while maintaining boundaries that many have tried and failed to cross. Little Richard. The Architect's Conflict. Little Richard was rock and roll before rock and roll had a name. His explosive performances, wild piano playing, and uninhibited stage presence in the 1950s broke down barriers and inspired everyone who came after him. But beneath the pompadour and the makeup was a man torn between two worlds, the freedom of his artistry and the strict religious background that told him who he was supposed to be. Richard's sexuality was an open secret in music circles. He wore makeup, had relationships with men, and pushed against every gender norm of his era. But he also repeatedly denounced homosexuality in interviews, particularly during periods when he returned to the church. These public rejections of his own identity revealed the deep internal conflict he carried throughout his life. The tension between his authentic self and his religious beliefs created a pattern of behavior that repeated for decades. He would embrace his flamboyance and sexuality, then retreat into religious orthodoxy and public repentance. Each cycle seemed to take a toll, creating a sense that he was never fully at peace with who he was. His struggle reflected the broader challenges faced by Black LGBTQ+ artists of his era, who navigated not just industry homophobia, but also conservative attitudes within their own communities. Little Richard gave the world the blueprint for rock and roll performance, but he paid a heavy price, never able to fully reconcile the different parts of his identity into a coherent whole. Dusty Springfield, the voice behind the veil. Dusty Springfield's voice was pure soul. As one of the most successful British artists of the 1960s, she brought a depth of emotion to pop music that set her apart from her contemporaries. Songs like Son of a Preacher Man showcased not just technical skill, but genuine feeling that resonated with millions. But while her professional success seemed effortless, her personal life was marked by struggle and concealment. Springfield was involved with women throughout her adult life, though she rarely discussed it publicly during her peak years. In the 1960s and 70s, such openness could have ended her career instantly. She watched as tabloids speculated and gossip columnists whispered, but she maintained a careful silence, protecting herself and her partners from public scrutiny. The strain of hiding took its toll. Springfield struggled with alcohol abuse and depression, self-medicating to cope with the disconnect between her public image and private reality. She gave interview after interview about her music, her style, her influences. Anything but the truth about who she was and who she loved. It wasn't until 1970 that she obliquely acknowledged her sexuality in an interview, and even then in vague terms that left room for interpretation. Full openness would wait until much later in her life, after the peak of her fame had passed. By then, she had spent decades paying the psychological price of hiding, a reminder that even success couldn't shield artists from the demands of living a double life. Jobriath. The tragedy of being too soon. Jobriath wanted to be a star. More than that, he wanted to be openly gay, and a star, believing that the early 1970s glam rock scene had created space for such honesty. Signed by Elektra Records and heavily promoted as the American Bowie, he seemed poised for breakthrough success. His music was theatrical and ambitious, his image unapologetically queer. But the world wasn't ready. The marketing campaign around Jobriath emphasized his sexuality explicitly, with advertisements that pushed boundaries and made his queerness central to his image. Rather than attracting audiences, it repelled them. Radio stations refused to play his music. Concert venues canceled shows. Even the LGBTQ+ community, many of whom were still deeply closeted in the early 70s, didn't rally behind him. He had gambled everything on openness and lost. The rejection was swift and complete. His albums flopped commercially, and the label dropped him after just 2 releases. The music industry, having briefly flirted with the idea of an openly gay rock star, quickly retreated. Jobriath's career was over almost before it began, a cautionary tale that other musicians observed carefully. He spent his remaining years in obscurity, living in self-imposed isolation in New York's Chelsea Hotel. When he died of AIDS-related complications in 1983, few noticed. His story stands as a reminder of the risks faced by those who were too honest too soon, and the price paid by pioneers who arrived before the world was ready to follow. Melissa Etheridge, the Heartland Rocker's Choice. Melissa Etheridge built her career on authenticity. Her raspy voice and heartfelt lyrics about love and loss connected with audiences who heard genuine emotion in every song. She came from Kansas, played blues rock that felt distinctly American, and seemed like someone you could trust to tell the truth. But for years, she kept one truth carefully hidden. In the early 1990s, as her fame grew, Etheridge faced a decision many artists before her had confronted: remain silent about her sexuality or risk everything by coming out. She was at the peak of her commercial success, with hit albums and sold-out tours. The conventional wisdom was clear. Coming out would destroy her career, alienate her fan base, and end her mainstream success. In 1993, she made a different choice. At the Triangle Ball, celebrating President Clinton's inauguration, Etheridge came out publicly, acknowledging she was a lesbian. The music industry braced for backlash. Some advisors had warned her against it, predicting career suicide. But something unexpected happened. Her fans stayed loyal. If anything, her openness made her music resonate even more deeply. The response to Etheridge's coming out marked a potential turning point. She proved that an artist could be openly gay and maintain a successful mainstream career. But the path she walked was still narrow, and she remained one of relatively few openly LGBTQ+ artists achieving significant commercial success in rock music during that era. Her courage opened doors, but the industry's acceptance remained conditional and limited. Judas Priest, the leather aesthetic's hidden code. Judas Priest's visual style became synonymous with heavy metal itself. The leather, the studs, the motorcycle imagery, it all suggested toughness, rebellion, and uncompromising masculinity. Fans around the world adopted the look, not realizing they were appropriating aesthetic codes borrowed directly from gay leather culture. The irony was lost on most. Heavy metal's most masculine imagery had queer origins. Rob Halford, as the architect of this visual style, had pulled inspiration from the gay clubs and leather bars he frequented. The leather cap, the studded wristbands, the chains, these weren't random fashion choices, but elements of a specific subculture. By bringing them into metal, Halford created a space where he could be himself while hiding in plain sight. The metal community celebrated the toughness these elements represented, completely unaware of their actual cultural context. This disconnect persisted for years. Metalheads, who would have been uncomfortable with queer culture, enthusiastically embraced its aesthetic markers, recontextualizing them as symbols of heterosexual masculine aggression. Halford, meanwhile, performed in leather and studs, expressing his identity through coded signals that his audience couldn't read. When Halford eventually came out, the revelation recontextualized decades of imagery and performance. Suddenly, fans had to confront the fact that the uniform of heavy metal had always had different meanings to different people. The leather aesthetic that defined the genre carried a hidden history, a reminder that queer culture had been influencing mainstream music in ways most people never recognized or acknowledged. K.D. Lang, the country outcast. K.D. Lang's voice could break hearts. As a country singer in the 1980s, she achieved something remarkable: critical acclaim and commercial success in a genre not known for embracing outsiders. Her powerful vocals and unique style earned her Grammy Awards and respect from country music traditionalists. But success in country music came with unspoken rules, and Lang was about to break the most fundamental one. In 1992, Lang appeared on the cover of Vanity Fair with supermodel Cindy Crawford in a provocative image that made her sexuality impossible to ignore. The headline, "K.D. Lang Cuts It Close," accompanied a photo that was clearly meant to generate controversy. For Lang, the cover was a statement of pride. For country music, it was a betrayal. The backlash was immediate and severe. Country radio stations dropped her music. Former fans organized album-burning events. The genre that had celebrated her talent suddenly wanted nothing to do with her. Nashville's doors, once open, slammed shut. The message was clear: you can be different in country music as long as you keep quiet about it. Lang refused to keep quiet. Her career survived by pivoting away from country music entirely. She found new audiences in pop and adult contemporary formats, proving her talent transcended genre boundaries. But the cost was real. She lost the community that had first embraced her music, and country music lost one of its most gifted vocalists. The industry's rejection of Lang revealed the conditional nature of its acceptance, a reminder that success could vanish the moment an artist refused to play by unwritten rules. Pet Shop Boys. The duo's deliberate distance. Pet Shop Boys became one of the most successful duos in pop history, with a sound that was sophisticated, ironic, and distinctly British. Neil Tennant's voice, paired with Chris Lowe's electronic compositions, created hits that dominated charts throughout the 1980s and beyond. But while their music was everywhere, the duo themselves remained curiously distant from public view, especially regarding their personal lives. Tennant, the group's vocalist and primary lyricist, was in a long-term relationship with a man, but he didn't discuss it publicly for years. His lyrics often dealt with loneliness, longing, and relationships, but always with enough ambiguity to leave interpretation open. Songs like Being Boring address themes of mortality and lost friends during the AIDS crisis without making explicit statements that might alienate mainstream audiences. The duo's approach to privacy was deliberate and strategic. In interviews, they focused on craft, production techniques, and artistic influences. When questions about personal matters arose, responses were polite but evasive. This strategy allowed them to maintain commercial success while living authentically in private, a compromise many artists of their era made. Tennant eventually came out publicly in 1994, though characteristically without fanfare or extensive explanation. By then, Pet Shop Boys were established enough that the revelation didn't damage their career. But the years of careful distance had already been spent. Years of weighing every interview answer and maintaining boundaries between public and private selves. Their success came at the cost of constant vigilance. Marlon Riggs, the documentarian's truth. Marlon Riggs wasn't a rock star in the traditional sense, but his influence on music culture was profound. As a filmmaker and poet, he created groundbreaking documentaries like Tongues Untied that explored black gay identity with unflinching honesty. His work influenced countless musicians, particularly in hip-hop and R&B, even as those genres remained largely hostile to LGBTQ+ expression. Riggs refused to separate his blackness from his queerness, arguing that both identities were essential to understanding his experience. This intersectional approach was radical in the late 1980s and early 90s, when both the black community and the LGBTQ+ community often treated these identities as mutually exclusive. His documentaries forced audiences to confront their own biases and assumptions. The backlash against his work was fierce. Conservative politicians used his films as examples of why arts funding should be eliminated. Religious leaders condemned him from pulpits. Some in the black community accused him of perpetuating stereotypes or prioritizing gay identity over racial solidarity. But Riggs never wavered, continuing to create art that reflected his complete self. His death from AIDS-related complications in 1994 came just as his influence was beginning to be fully recognized. Musicians who had been inspired by his work were starting to incorporate more honest explorations of sexuality into their art. Riggs had planted seeds that would take years to fully grow, demonstrating that cultural change often comes through the slow accumulation of courageous voices refusing to be silenced. Frank Ocean, the hip-hop barrier. Frank Ocean faced a challenge unlike those confronted by rock musicians who came before him. Hip-hop had built its identity partly around a hyper-masculine aesthetic that left little room for any deviation. When Ocean, on the eve of releasing his debut album in 2012, published a letter on Tumblr acknowledging his first love was a man, the music world held its breath. Would hip-hop accept one of its rising stars being openly queer? The response was mixed but mostly positive, at least on the surface. Fellow artists expressed support, critics praised his courage, and his album went on to achieve both commercial success and critical acclaim. Ocean seemed to have broken through a barrier, proving that hip-hop could accept LGBTQ+ artists. But looking deeper, the reality was more complicated. Ocean's success came with conditions. He rarely discussed his sexuality in subsequent interviews, and his music dealt with relationships in ways that often left gender ambiguous. He had opened a door, but only part way, and the pressure to avoid making his sexuality too central to his public image was clearly present. Hip-hop's acceptance of Ocean was real but fragile, requiring him to navigate carefully. His example showed both progress and its limits. Yes, an openly queer artist could succeed in hip-hop, but the path remained narrow and conditional. Ocean blazed a trail, but the journey for those following him would still be difficult, requiring constant negotiation between authenticity and acceptability in a genre still wrestling with its own biases. George Michael, the superstar's forced revelation. George Michael seemed to have it all. As half of Wham and later as a solo artist, he dominated pop music throughout the 1980s and 90s. His good looks, smooth voice, and undeniable charisma made him a global superstar. Behind the scenes, he struggled with his sexuality, knowing that coming out could destroy the image that had made him famous. Michael managed his public persona carefully, dating women publicly while maintaining relationships with men privately. The balancing act was exhausting and required constant vigilance. Every interview, every photograph, every public appearance was carefully managed to maintain the illusion that he fit conventional expectations about what a male pop star should be. In 1998, that careful management shattered when Michael was arrested in a public restroom in Los Angeles. The incident forced the revelation he had been trying to control, thrusting his sexuality into the tabloids in the most humiliating way possible. Rather than coming out on his own terms, he was outed through scandal and legal proceedings. Michael handled the aftermath with surprising grace, acknowledging his sexuality and refusing to apologize for it. But the damage was done. Years of hiding had taken a psychological toll, and the way his sexuality became public knowledge added trauma to what should have been a moment of liberation. His experience revealed the impossible position closeted stars occupied, damned if they came out, devastated if they were outed, unable to simply exist without constantly managing public perception. Sylvester, the disco truth-teller. Sylvester didn't hide. While other artists carefully managed their images, he was unapologetically himself, a flamboyant, gender non-conforming black man with a falsetto that could soar over any disco track. His hits, You Make Me Feel, Mighty Real, and Dance, Disco Heat, became anthems in the late 1970s, finding audiences in both mainstream pop and gay clubs. His openness was radical for its time. Sylvester performed in full makeup and dramatic costumes, refusing to tone down his presentation for mainstream acceptability. He was clear about his sexuality, his identity, and his refusal to apologize for any of it. In interviews, he spoke candidly about being gay, when most artists still carefully avoided the topic. But his authenticity came at a cost. While he achieved success, he never quite broke through to the superstardom that seemed within reach. Some radio stations wouldn't play his music, unwilling to promote someone so openly different. Mainstream television appearances were rare. Despite his undeniable talent, doors remained closed because he refused to make himself more palatable to conservative audiences. When Sylvester died from AIDS-related complications in 1988, the music industry largely ignored his passing. The media that had been reluctant to embrace him during his life showed little interest in memorializing him after death. His legacy would be preserved by the LGBTQ+ community that had always seen him as a hero, even as mainstream culture tried to forget he had existed at all. The Pretenders' Chrissie Hynde. The Allies' blind spot. Chrissie Hynde built the Pretenders into one of rock's most respected bands with a tough, no-nonsense approach that earned credibility in a male-dominated industry. She was outspoken about sexism, inequality, and the struggles women faced in rock music. But when it came to LGBTQ+ issues within her own band, her awareness seemed to have limits. Pete Farndon, the Pretenders' original bassist, was reportedly involved with men, though he never discussed it publicly. The band's internal dynamics were complicated by substance abuse issues that eventually led to Farndon's firing in 1982. He died of a drug overdose the following year, at just 30 years old. Whether his struggles were connected to hiding aspects of his identity remains speculation, but those close to him suggested the pressure of concealment played a role. Hynde has spoken extensively about the tragedy of losing band members, but rarely about the specific pressures that might have contributed to Farndon's destructive behavior. Her public advocacy for various causes didn't extend to openly addressing LGBTQ+ struggles within rock music, perhaps because she didn't recognize them as connected to the other inequalities she fought against. Her story reveals how even progressive figures can have blind spots, failing to see struggles that don't directly affect them. Rock music in the late 70s and early 80s was difficult for everyone who didn't fit the mold, but some struggles remained invisible, even to those fighting for greater inclusion and acceptance. Tracy Chapman, the folk singer's silence. Tracy Chapman emerged in 1988 with a self-titled debut album that felt like a revelation. Her acoustic guitar, socially conscious lyrics, and distinctive voice cut through the overproduced sound dominating pop radio. Songs like Fast Car and Talkin' 'Bout a Revolution became instant classics, establishing her as an important voice in contemporary music. But as her fame grew, questions about her personal life began to surface. Chapman has maintained strict privacy about her relationships throughout her career, never publicly labeling her sexuality despite decades of speculation. She's been photographed with women, and those within the music industry widely understood she was in same-sex relationships, but she has consistently refused to discuss the matter in interviews. Her silence on the subject is strategic and principled. Chapman has argued that her personal life is irrelevant to her music, and that the media's fixation on sexuality distracts from the social issues her songs address. She wants conversations about her work to focus on inequality, racism, and economic justice, not on who she loves. But her refusal to be open has also drawn criticism from LGBTQ+ advocates who argue that visibility matters, especially for someone with her platform. They suggest that her silence, while personally understandable, represents a missed opportunity to provide representation and support for queer fans. Chapman has held firm to her boundaries, insisting that privacy is a right, not something artists must surrender for public approval. Her stance raises questions about what obligations, if any, public figures have to represent communities they may belong to. These 20 stories barely scratch the surface. For every artist mentioned here, countless others navigated similar struggles in obscurity, their truths never reaching public knowledge. The history of rock and roll is incomplete without acknowledging these hidden narratives, the double lives, the careful concealment, the courage it took to exist authentically in an industry built on image and perception. What emerges from these stories is a pattern. Talented individuals forced to choose between honesty and success, between career survival and personal integrity. Some found ways to be open and maintain their careers. Others paid devastating prices for their honesty. Many more simply remained silent, the psychological toll of hiding accumulating over years until it became unbearable. The rock and roll industry promised freedom, but often delivered conformity. It celebrated rebellion while punishing those who rebelled in the wrong ways. These artists helped change that reality, slowly and painfully, opening paths that future generations would walk more easily. Their legacy isn't just the music they created, it's the doors they opened and the barriers they challenged, even when doing so cost them everything. If these stories moved you, consider subscribing. There's so much more history that needs to be told honestly, without the sanitized versions that erase complicated truths. Let's keep exploring the real stories together.